What's up, yo?
Hi.
Sorry, can somebody say something? I'm not sure if I can hear you.
Hello.
Okay, sweet, I can. Thank you. I think we're just waiting on Delvon and Josiah, right?
Do you all want to get started in like 1 more minute or
Does anyone have Josiah's number or anything? He's not in the group me.
Oh wait, I think I actually do.
If not, I can message him on Canvas as well and just let him know that we're gonna get started.
I sent him a text.
Should we get started?
Yeah, let's do it. I can read the first question if y'all want. The podcast mentions a number of misperceptions that people tend to hold when they think about Washington, D.C. What are some of those misperceptions, and why do the people featured in the podcast think that those misunderstandings negatively impact their fight for statehood?
I can start. So they kind of touched on this in every episode that like a lot of people who aren't from the DC area don't know that there's like actual people that live in DC. But one of the interviews that stuck out to me was in episode 6, when one of the guests was talking about they were doing like a march for statehood in DC, and he stopped some tourists and asked them if they thought that DC should be a state, and the tourist said something along the lines of like, why would you be a state when you work for us? Because they thought that everyone in DC was a government worker, and like that was literally it. And then once he explained it to them, they agreed that they should have statehood. But like growing up in the DC area, I didn't think that that was like a like I thought people knew that there was real people that lived in DC, but I guess not. So that was surprising to me, and obviously that negatively impacts the fight for statehood, because if people don't understand that there's like real people outside of government workers, not that government workers aren't real people, but like actual citizens that don't work for the government in DC, how are they gonna like help them fight for statehood?
Yeah, I pulled that, but I also pulled a couple other things. I said, so like one of the misperceptions is people in DC never had the right to vote, and like that's the way it was intended originally, which we kind of found out wasn't true. Um, and I also pulled some like the DC's high crime rate. Be is because I think there's a lot of talk about how DC's high crime rate is because they're like soft on crime and it's not being prosecuted. And I think they showed a lot in that one episode about that prison system, that like most of that is up to the federal government. So those are the things I pulled in addition to the um, quotes about the federal employees.
Yeah, I actually talked similarly, pulled from episode 6, just the misconception about there just being federal employees in the district. But I also think that, like you said, the high crime in the area is kind of gives off a bad perception of DC and kind of hurts their fight for statehood. And I think that it's like they talked about later, I talk about it later in the questions, but how the DC mayor kind of like gave everybody a bad impression. They really took away DC's right to vote because of that one mayor. So I thought that it was like that also hurt their fight for statehood, even though that shouldn't really be a thing, in my opinion.
I had pulled that too. I think that was heavily, I can't remember if it was episode 2, if it was episode 3. But yeah, that being a reason for people to see that or say that DC is unable to govern itself effectively. I pointed out issues like the budget mismanagement, but then also one of the, and it's not necessarily a misperception, but it's just like something that it was an argument that was made. Not that I agree with it, but that the perception that DC residents are unfit for self-governance is often associated with these like racial undertones. Is if you're not seeing that, if your opinion isn't that DC is filled with federal government workers, politicians, and lobbyists, what have you, then the other side of that is, well, then it's a majority Black population, or it's a majority brown population. And that's the reason why some of the people were making some of their arguments, I feel like, in the podcast. Or not that some of the people were making their arguments based on that, but that it was a concern that was brought up from especially a lot of Republican voices that were speaking. And that sort of, in a weird way, paralleled, in their opinion, the the crime rates that they're talking about in DC, which is weird.
Yeah, you could also like look at the crime rate like a reflection like their government basically like I think I forgot their what was the mayor name? Oh yeah, Marion Barry, like how like he ran it. And like outside of DC, like people in DC they love Marion Barry, but outside of it, like you saw like that people had like a whole different perception of him. They thought he was corrupt and stuff. And they saw like all his like actions he did, like his arrests and everything like that. But people inside these like they knew like how much he was doing and like how much and like how they liked him and things like that.
Yeah, he's like a huge figure inside of DC, and it's like anyone that you can like I've talked to like one person outside of the state that like knew about him and terrible perception of him. So I guess that also like really did hurt the state of the movement.
Yeah, even like with some of my family members, like even coming like even when they used to live back in DC, like they now live in Maryland, like they still like consider him be like the mayor for life and everything back when he was alive.
Do y'all want to move on to the next part of the question? I can read it. When you think about Washington, D.C., did you operate under any of the misperceptions that are discussed in the podcast?
I can start. I grew up like going to DC like all the time, so it was pretty obvious that there's a huge city there. You know, once you actually are there, like there's no way everyone is federal employees there. Like it's just impossible. But even if they were, I kind of was never really like scared of the federal government growing up. I was always like raised under the notion that they're there to help us. So it was like even if I did like kind of think it was like mostly federal, it didn't really like impact me. I still thought that they should be a state once I learned about it later in life, the whole statehood movement.
Yeah, I had a similar. Oh, sorry, Jules, you can go.
Oh, you-
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I had said kind of something similar where it's like not exactly that I was operating into the misperceptions. Like you walk through DC and especially in certain parts of DC, like you're seeing people who are racing around the hill and they're all in suits and you're like, okay, yeah, federal government worker, probably. But then if you could like conceptualize that and you understand that like a lot of those people are actually living in surrounding counties like out like Arlington and Alexandria and McLean because they have more housing and land and these people who for a lot of people who didn't grow up in that area are it's like the perception that oh these people who are living in DC or these people who work in DC are probably like crazy rich. I grew up close to here in Richmond, and I know when I was a kid that was definitely my perception. Yeah, though I mean my assumption when I was a kid was that like why would why would you want to actually live in DC? Because that's just like, for the most part, a lot of apartments and, it's, whatever. And not saying those apartments aren't luxury apartments, whatever, but you go into those areas like Arlington, Alexandria, McLean, and a lot of the figures that you might like, be thinking or working in DC actually live out there. And so they're, not actually the residents of DC that we're talking about in this podcast. They're just people who work there. And that's, totally different.
I had a similar view. I grew up in Alexandria, so like really close to DC, and both my parents worked for the government and commuted, and like a lot of their friends that they worked with also commuted. So I kind of, I guess, had like an opposite view of some of the misperceptions we hear in the podcast, where like, especially when I was younger, I thought a lot of the people that worked in the government commuted, which I think is true, but I mean, it's probably half and half. And then a lot of the people that actually lived in DC worked outside of the government. That was kind of my view until I grew up. But yeah.
I focused on a completely different part of the podcast because I grew up like a mile outside of DC. So for me, I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on like what the population. I worked there for a while. Like it wasn't really none of that stuff felt really new to me. So I focused more on what I felt like I didn't really understand at all was like the justice system there. Like that episode was really interesting to me. Because I had no idea. I did know they didn't have like long-term prison in DC, but I guess I always assumed they sent them to like a Maryland or Virginia prison. So I had no idea that they like could send them so far away. And also about like the prosecution and how they can't really vote for prosecutors and stuff, like a lot of that stuff. All of that was stuff that I didn't really understand at all. And so that was something I really focused on, because like most of that was pretty new information to me, even though I grew up right outside of DC.
Do you guys want to move to the next one? Okay, how much thought had you given, oh wait, sorry. Oh yeah, how much thought have you given the issue of DC statehood before listening to the podcast? How much do you think you'd feel if, how do you think you'd feel if you were a resident of DC?
I mean, I didn't really, I didn't have any of the, like knew that DC wasn't considered a state, of course, but, yeah, the podcast was really eye-opening for me. I mean, I'm someone who grew up not even like in Nova and like not near like that area, so I wasn't necessarily surrounded by DC. We took day or weekend trips up there when I was a kid. Like that was, what DC was to me. Um, and I had a fairly limited understanding, I'd say, of the overall history that goes into the debates around DC statehood. But I know like within the last year when I like, actually finally conceptualized that like DC doesn't have like senators. They don't have like really representation. I didn't realize that the representation that they do have in the House, the one person isn't like a voting member. That was new to me with the podcast. Like, all of those things, I know that for myself as someone who I would consider myself like at least adequately like politically active, I'd be deeply frustrated with not having voting representation. Because I feel like right now, like I like argue with my friends about like, hey, like you need to also vote in these elections. And like, those are like elections that, some people who live in DC who, don't have senators or don't have that kind of representation, are actively unable to vote for. And I was just saying that I feel even just thinking about it frustrated.
Yeah.
I
No, go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. I said something similar. Like I knew through high school that DC wasn't considered a state, but I didn't really know what that meant and that they had so much less representation than the rest of us. Which is like honestly kind of embarrassing to admit as a political science student because this is such a big issue, but I feel like a lot of people lack education on it. And I didn't know, like last semester, I took another class with Dr. R and she had a statehood activist come speak to us. And that's like when I first was really introduced to the issue and like the first time I understood that it's actually a really big problem. And I would kind of feel the same way, just like extremely frustrated if I was a resident of DC. And it's also something that like post-graduation, I'm planning on moving back home, but if I were to move to DC, it's something I would heavily consider first, just because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly I'm in like the same boat. I thought I knew a lot about it, and it's like embarrassing as a poli sci student, but like, I did not know nearly as much as I thought I did. Like Joel said, I didn't even know that they had a representative to begin with. I thought that there was like zero representation at all. And for me, it's like the whole taxation without representation line of logic is pretty easy to follow growing up. You hear it your entire life, like starting with the American Revolution. So the fact that that extends like everywhere in the United States, except for the territories, as we learned later, but everywhere in the United States except DC is like mind blowing to me. And like you guys, I'd be extremely frustrated.
Yeah, I definitely would.
Go ahead.
I say yeah, like I definitely would too. Like even like being like growing up around that surrounding area of Maryland, like I always thought like okay, it's I assume DC was a state because the way they operate and everything, but like even like more like more and more when people tell me like no, it's more of a district, it's not a state. I'm like, I feel like it should be because like the way it looks like a state, it looks like a state. It operates like a state except for the representation. Like that's the only thing it's missing. That's what I feel right now.
I'm actually in like a little bit of a different boat because I was pretty involved in DC politics for when I lived there, for various reasons, but I knew a lot of the council people. Um, so I was somewhat familiar with it. I guess like one part of the argument that I thought the podcast laid out really well was about like the racism and civil rights side of it. And I feel like that's something I was kind of aware of, but definitely not something that I had given enough thought to beforehand. Um, because I wasn't really focused on the causes of it as much as like the solutions to things in DC. So that was a really interesting like perspective and history to look at. I mean, obviously like very important. And um yeah, I had just never really been introduced to it from that perspective before. It's definitely not something that like a lot of government representatives focus on in the fight for statehood in some ways. I don't know if that makes sense. Like they focus on the aspect of like not being able to vote being like a civil rights issue, but not like the fact that like this is a majority black and brown area and like that can have something to do with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I didn't even know that DC was a majority black city. Like I had no idea. That's not something that's like I think talked about in like Northern Virginia, and it's a huge deal. Like that heavily impacts the way things shake out in DC. So it's like that should be talked about.
Do we want to move to that next question? All right. What sorts of arguments were used during the founding era of US history to justify the decision to locate the capital in Washington, D.C. and to create it as a mountain state?
I can start. In episode 2, they said the capital of the government should not be under the control of any state as written in the Constitution, which I guess kind of makes sense, but that only really is functional if you only have the capital there and nothing else. Like if people are just living there and not working in the government, then that disproportionately affects them, which we see today, obviously.
I also pulled from episode 2. I talked about how they were fearing revolt or mutiny after the whole thing that happened with the Philadelphia militia, where they staged what was pretty much a protest outside of Congress, and then Hamilton tried to call in the Philadelphia militia to stop the whole thing, and they were like, "What, you want us to call in a militia to fight against the revolutionaries who just got our independence?" Like, no, absolutely not going to happen. And then they started using that exclusionary or exclusive jurisdiction, I think was the term. Um, and yeah, so I think that that's kind of like what they centered their arguments in, at least historically.
I pulled off of those sections as well, but the thing that I additionally pulled was about the location. I pulled the quote like Southern states did want the capital in the South, the symbolic way to protect the institution of slavery. Um, and so I pulled a couple of quotes about how they use the location as kind of this like bargaining chip for financial gain as well.
I had actually pulled that same quote to the not the bargaining chip one, but the protection of the institution of slavery. I just lost my train of thought. Give me 2 seconds.
Are you guys Hamilton fans? Because the room where it happened is like a banger song. I think they played it in episode 2, just like that.
They
Yeah, I like
did,
a few
I
of their
think.
songs.
I mean, I don't know if I would consider myself a fan, but definitely, I don't know. I'm into it. I watched it. It was pretty good. It's a cool way to like talk about the history. I like that part a lot.
Kind of surprised,
The
like no,
songs are really good. What'd you say? Sorry.
I'm just surprised that nobody like continued with the genre and like did like
Yeah,
more musicals.
that's fair. I think it's partially because like Hamilton has a pretty cool, like pretty not cool, pretty like I guess complicated story that might be hard to find in other places. And also it was unique in the sense that it hadn't really been told a lot.
I'd pay real money to see Woodrow Wilson the musical.
I think I'm back on my train of thought here. I had pulled and this was in the original like listing guide talking about episode 2. Um I had forgotten what the name of the book was, but um we talked a lot with the podcast talked about a lot, not we talked a lot to the authors of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy. Um and they're discussing how like the capital actually did matter, the location, which is, you talk about in the musical Hamilton, like that's the whole thing, is like it's the trade-off of the national bank for um sort of that protection. um and I wanted to pull the stat of more than half of the enslaved people in the United States at that time lived in Maryland and Virginia, which are the 2 states the founding fathers used to form the capital district. And I just think that like that puts this into perspective just like so much. Because I mean I think about like the reasons why I mean, as someone who did listen to Hamilton, like I was always very confused of like what that like trade-off really meant, like what that was. And this podcast actually helped me put that into perspective of like, oh well, that actually not necessarily that like you couldn't like make that assumption, but that like when it puts it into words and into that context, that it's like easier to um understand, definitely.
Yeah, they definitely did not talk about that part in the musical.
Okay, do you guys want to move on to the next part? Okay, it says, how has the decision to create DC as a non-state impacted the people living in the city, both historically and in more modern and or current politics? Use specific examples of real-world events and or policy to highlight the impact that this decision has on residents of DC.
I mean, it's easy to say like or to point out that there's the lack of voting representation in Congress. DC has no residents have no senators, and the sole House delegate can't vote on legislation, and that directly means that DC residents have no direct voice in the federal laws that impact them. And then when you parallel that with the fact that there's congressional interference in DC's local affairs, like we got to see that with the protests that were happening in Lafayette Park that were mentioned, I think, in episode 1, and then Trump's deployment of the National Guard on those areas. There's, I mean, those two were two real, sort of policy real world events that I had like focused on, where it's just a way for either Congress to impose its will on DC residents without their consent, or for DC residents to just have like a lack of state and representation in the first place.
I said something similar to you, Jules, and like the two, I mean, every episode basically has examples of this, but the two that stood out to me the most was one, what McKenna was talking about earlier with, in episode 5, when they talk about how incarcerated Washingtonians can literally be sent anywhere. Like, that's not something I knew prior, and that's obviously a huge disadvantage to them, which they kind of briefly discuss, especially like when they're reintegrating after being released. And then also how DC got significantly less COVID funding than all the other states. That was another one that stood out to me, and I didn't know about that as well. And even though they had like more cases than I think 2 or 3 states, it's just like blatantly unfair. Um,
Yeah, I kind of pulled from the same episode and focused on the judicial system. In was episode 5. I thought it was crazy that they have an attorney general that gets appointed by the president, and they're the only one in the country that the people don't elect. So essentially, like going back to what Joel said, without the voting rights, they have no like recourse. If the attorney general decides to start prosecuting things like really weirdly, then the people have nothing that they can do about it. And kind of going off what you were saying, Amelia, is that like when a DC resident gets sent like way across the country, it completely separates them from their family and from their community, which increases the recidivism rate. And they're just going to end up right back because they can't reintegrate into their community. Like I had a buddy who made some mistakes, and then he got locked up, and then he got sent to El Salvador, and it completely cut him off from his family, from everything. It was very, very hard for him. And I just think that that's crazy that they can't be sent to somewhere closer.
I agree, and especially considering the level of poverty a lot of like these people's families are in, like they're not going to be able to take the day off and pay for a plane ticket to wherever. Like that's just not realistic. My sister works in a DC school as a special ed teacher in one of the poorest areas of DC. It's like exclusively for men, and they're like middle schoolers. And I mean, like in DC right now, there are like middle schoolers stealing cars and like overdosing, and like that's the realistic thing that she sees every day in that area. So like, I just think that sending people like further away definitely has a really big impact because they have no contact. And like also additionally, like kids and their families suffer. So the prisoner suffers and whoever else might be in their life suffers from not being able to see them for however long. Um, and I definitely like I talked to my sister. She definitely thinks that like really impacts them. I know we were talking about this unrelated the other day, but
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I remember like one time, I think it was 2 years ago. I think it was in around like the metro station in DC. I think my mom like her whole car got stolen and got to like they got found they found it joint they found it like 5 blocks later, like all busted up in total. And I think it like all go back to like the historical standpoint that was talked about episode 2 with Boss Shepherd and like how he abused like the rights that DC had at first, and then they took it out on the whole district as a whole and took away all those rights they had.
yeah, my sister's car was stolen from in front of their school's playground by students. And she teaches elementary, or her school teaches, I think, 5th through 8th.
I had a friend's car, his window got kicked in right outside the Peruvian embassy.
Yeah. It was just crazy that it was still like in front of the playground. It was really sad, honestly.
Yeah, and the cop that responded to it, we were like, "Does this happen often, like on Embassy Row?" And he was like, "Yeah, like, multiple times a day. Like, you will not be the only one tonight." Mm.
Yeah, well, it's just like unfortunately also a part of it is just out of necessity, which is really depressing, but true. You know, kids aren't stealing cars for funsies. And you don't learn how to steal a car for funsies.
This is kind of like a different part of the question, but like throughout the podcast, like a common theme that I saw and kind of like what I took away the most from it is that I feel like obviously there's like a bunch of historical factors that have like disadvantaged DC over time, but I feel like the biggest thing that or like common pattern that I saw was that like a lack of clarification and like specifics in a lot of legislation has really kind of like disadvantaged them, like the Organic Act, how it just doesn't clarify how they can vote, so then they just can't vote. And then also like the in episode the Organic Act is talked about in episode 2, and then also when they say like Congress will have exclusive legislation, but that's never like clarified and nobody really knows what that means. I just think in general, like a lot of the legislation regarding DC is so unspecific that it's been more negative than positive for them.
And you can kind of look at that as like the reason why this like stuff, like those pieces of legislation like get passed in the first place is if you pass overbroad like legislation, then it's just like an interpretation matter for people like later, which is part of the reason why like the things that we see that like impact DC the most, like you mentioned the Organic Act and you mentioned I blanked on the other one. Like they're overbroad for a reason. It's a strategic, you know, matter, I think. I think I will, in my opinion, I think it's strategic. You also could make the argument that it was just like a, you know, forgotten, like, you know, or like maybe not so thought out issue. But I mean, looking at the rest of the podcast and like, you know, listening to the rest of the arguments that have been made, it's like I don't think there's a way that I can view that besides it being sort of strategic, that they're, you know, making these things like purposefully difficult to understand and purposely difficult to either work around or just like further interpret.
It definitely feels like there's like some purposeful, like, let's make this as complicated as humanly possible, so people just cannot understand it.
I say that and then I'm like, maybe I'm being cynical right now, but I don't know.
Well, I think with the Organic Act specifically, I agree with you, Jules, on that. But I think they said the Organic Act was like hastily passed and they were just being lazy and like trying to get legislation out as fast as possible.
Well, I think it was that they couldn't agree. And so they were like, we're just going to leave it out so we can get this passed before our terms are up.
Which even that is such a funny argument. I know that's like how things like work and like that's like, you know, what to expect, to be like, yeah, we can't agree, so we're just going to pass it. But then that's just so neglectful and so just I can't think of any other word besides just silly. That is so silly.
Y'all want
Does-
to move on to number 3? Or sorry.
I was gonna say the exact same.
Okay. One of the things that can make debating DC statehood fraught with conflict are the assumptions that each side makes about the motives of people who disagree with them. For example, the podcast discusses the Republican assertion that Democrats' support for DC statehood is merely a power grab, not a principled stand. What do you make of that assertion? I can start if you guys want. I think honestly, like the point that it's a Democratic power grab is kind of like a valid one, low key. Just because I think that both parties kind of operate under this, they operate under the assumption that they're going to preserve the power they have and advance it. But I also think that it's still a moral issue, just in the sense that like people can't vote. That's not okay. So it doesn't really matter if that's the case. I also think that if DC were majority red, that Republicans would want it to be a state and that Democrats would be like, no, 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 no. But that's just kind of my cynical attitude about both parties, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that phrase, okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I would agree with you saying like basically there like always some truth like the both what both sides are talking about. Like, yeah, it can be seen as a power grab or it can just be seen as like them like getting the rights they deserve as a statehood. But yeah, if it was like the other way around, yeah, I think the Democrats would be like come up and say something about it too.
I think the argument itself of the power grab is maybe just that phrase is just like an oversimplification. Um, because we look at we just examined in the last book we read the partisan breakdown and this large split and difference between parties. And yeah, both parties, if they had control over the majority of like you know, a district like DC, they would be wanting the exact opposite for the other people. Like that's just like where we're at in America right now. And um I think that the issue is becoming more heavily politicized than it needs to be, right? Like the whole thing is that like I had pulled a quote from a statehood activist who said, you can't have a more fair and equitable America without granting representation to DC students, or DC students, DC residents. Um, and that's like kind of like what my whole thought process has been operating under this entire time. Um, but then I think about this phrase of like power grab and I'm like I at first I was like I don't necessarily think that's true, but there's definitely clear motive for Democrats to be wanting to push this kind of like legislation and try to get DC to have like you know they want more votes and want more, and Republicans would do the exact same thing. So I think it's just disappointing how politicized the issue, how not politicized, how much partisanship is affecting the issue that I don't think it necessarily should be in the first place.
I agree with you, Joel. That's kind of what I said. I would like, I think it's partially true, probably, that that is a very big part of the reason why there's this like line of support. Um, where like of course if you can get more power, then you want more power. Like that's just the way our government works. But I also said like um with that being said, Democrats have a history of um trying to like further voting rights or like expand voting rights rather and stuff. So I don't think it's really like out of line with their with like what they would I guess normally do. I don't know how to phrase it better than that. So I was like, yeah, I don't think it's completely wrong, but I also don't know if it's like quite true either. I don't know if that's the only motive, at least for every person who's interested in it in Congress.
I pretty much said the same thing as everyone else. Like, I think it definitely plays a part, but it's not their sole motive for pushing statehood. And like you said, McKenna, a lot of the districts like stances on stuff align with the Democratic Party. So I think that's another reason.
Joel, if I'm not wrong, I think that you're trying to say that it's like overly polarized, but I'd also agree that it's like I think that it is overly politicized as well. Just in the sense that like I forgot to mention it was like chapter 1 that they brought up the moral issue, or not chapter, episode 1 that they brought up the whole idea that it's a moral issue, and I think that that should supersede politics when there's something like that on the line. That it really shouldn't fall along party lines. Like it just doesn't matter if it's a power grab. Like people can't vote.
Like this like moral and not Democrat like party, but democratic like is in our institution imperative um is kind of like what I was thinking. It's also funny because I feel like the polarization is, well, not that I think that the polarization is coming from the actual like arguments to like pass legislation to make this happen, as opposed to the maybe the arguments that are made from like statehood activists that like we like listen to in the podcast who are talking about that like moral imperative, versus then you like see that paralleled in the like the 2020 proposal of DC like statehood rights. And you hear the
Yeah.
argument based on that, and they're totally different.
Sorry, I thought you were done. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was done pretty much.
Even though this is kind of moving on to the other question, it also kind of like really relates back, because another thing that like made it harder for me to be like, yeah, that's totally 100% their motive, was their like Republican. I think it was Lindsey Graham who was. I can't remember who was. Wait, no, that's definitely not it. I can't remember who was quoted with this, but in the book, it was episode 1, or in the podcast, episode 1. It said, I can promise you this, from a South Carolina point of view, this is not a good deal for us. Being 2 of 50 is better than being 2 of 52. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure you just said that the reason why you don't want this to be a state is for for power reasons. So like you can't really argue much else, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was kind of like, I mean, you said what you said. So I guess that also made it a little bit more like, I can't disagree that this is very clearly like both partisans wanting to get or not lose power. Does that make sense?
No, definitely. I also pulled the same quote for the next question, and it was Lindsey Graham, I believe, that said being 2 is better, or being 2 of 50 is better than being 2 of 52. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, you're really saying that out loud. Like that's kind of crazy to me. And like we said earlier, or like I said earlier, it's just I think that parties just want to keep hold of the power that they already have, and Lindsey Graham just blatantly said it out loud. So.
I think then we can probably move on to that next question too. Where is it? Which is the similar example in the podcast is Democrats' own assertion that Republican opposition to DC statehood is a racist attempt to maintain their political advantage. What do you make of that assertion? I guess I can kind of start it, but I'll probably loop back around later. I feel like all of the Republican arguments around statehood like have had like may have racial undertones, and I was thinking specifically about, there was a quote, I think it was in the first episode too, that was, I think it was more so talking about DC's crime rate, but one of the, I can't remember who it was, had said something like, and quoting this verbatim, this like hug a thug mentality, and I was like, this is like so clearly like what are you saying? And I think that was like from the 90s, or the I can't remember what year it was, 93 question mark proposal of DC statehood. But like, quotes like that have like these like, undertones that you wouldn't ever want to hear from, your legislators. But then I feel like a lot of the GOP opposition has also been, they end up looping it back around to like political implications and those kind of concerns, as well as like constitutional questions, like talking about, well, what would you do with like that territory and the reassertion into Virginia and Maryland. So I feel like there is like a place in like some of the arguments, but I feel like that there also is like just enough like outside backing to have that not be the thing that the public is like focused on, or is like, specifically looking at. That might not have made sense, but I can re-elaborate later.
I think like we talked about in the first question, the race definitely plays a part in this for Republicans, and like there's a lot of quotes throughout, like you said, I think it was episode let me find it, sorry. Yeah, episode 4 where Tom Daly, I think he was a congressman, said the hug a thug thing, like as a justification for not giving DC statehood. and like said that they can't get their violent crime under control. And then also, the South Carolina senator that Walters sent, buses of Black activists to his district, how that senator was like really against statehood and would like bring watermelons to the DC mayor. I don't know if you guys remember that. That was episode 3. There's like obviously race plays a big part, especially throughout history, but I think like currently it's more of a power thing. Like we talked about in the last question. Um, like I'm sorry, I forgot what episode it was, Jules, but and Spencer, you both brought it up that being sorry, I'm blanking. I'm gonna come back to this.
Honestly, I only had the Lindsey Graham quote for this question, but the DC mayor going to meet with the representative, and that was blatantly and outwardly racist, and openly so. Was not hiding it in any way, shape, or form, and he was a huge. He was very much against the DC statehood movement. I believe was mentioned in the book. I didn't have it marked down, unfortunately, but just that combined with the fact that DC is a majority Black city, and then you've got this guy who's blatantly racist opposing it. Like, this is not a hard line of logic to follow. This is racially motivated to me. Do we want to move on to the next one? Does anyone have anything else? All right. Talk to some friends and family about this debate. Based on what you hear is the assumption that the issue breaks down neatly across partisan lines. Democrats equal support, Republicans equal opposition. An oversimplification, or does it seem to accurately reflect attitudes on the topic of DC statehood? Were there any additional points made when talking to other people about the topic that the podcast didn't touch on?
Okay, so like one response I got that was like interesting point of view to me like was they did like gain statehood. This person said like they would lose like they would lose their federal benefits, which they have like basically a free rec center used, free museums they have out there in DC, and they would probably be divided into counties like or even the wards like War 1 through 8, or even like Northeast County, Southwest County, Northwest County, Southeast County, things like that. And like the main arch point was the person was trying to get like it'd be too much going on if they would gain statehood like in the coming years, basically.
I only asked 2 of my friends, but I kind of thought that like it's kind of hard to determine if the issue breaks neither or not, since so many people are just not super educated on this topic. Like both of my friends that I asked knew that DC wasn't a state, but didn't know that they like basically have no representation, and like they had no idea what that meant for the residents of DC. And so it was kind of hard to like get a read on how the issue breaks for them, since they just really didn't know about it. But that was just my experience.
I had a discussion with my fundamentalist Christian grandparents about this, who are notoriously hard to convince of things. And I kind of had a similar experience to you, Amelia, where it's like they didn't really know too much about it, but they were still along partisan lines. You can imagine they're Republican, so they're kind of against DC statehood. But I had a similar experience that they had in episode 6, where like we talked about it earlier, the second you start laying down facts and you say these guys pay taxes, they go to war, they do literally everything else that normal Americans do, but they can't vote, that argument starts to break down pretty quickly, and the partisan lines start to break down. So that made me think that like this really is a issue of education and like messaging. Like you have to tell people.
I agree with you exactly. I think at the moment it is kind of partisan, but that's only because there's a lack of education. So people are just choosing to take the side that they're like supposed to take.
Yeah, I talked to my 2 roommates who are both with Peace and Love VCU art students, and I love talking to them about politics because they have no clue what's going on with anything ever. All the peace and love to them. And I was like, I just kind of like laid out some of the points that, I was trying to go back and forth like between like the 2 different arguments. And yeah, that point that you brought up, Spencer, that DC residents are American citizens who pay taxes and can serve in the military. Like that is like the thing that they're like, well, that's the thing that everyone can probably agree on. Like that's the thing that will break, like, make that like that is the element that feels like the meet you in the middle kind of, spaces of like, oh, that's the intro to get people to actually begin to understand this concept. Do we want to go to the next one with the okay. Overall, what arguments in the podcast did you find the most compelling in favor of DC statehood, or least compelling in the opposition to DC statehood?
I can start. So I thought this was one of the best arguments that they provided from the Senate, and it was from the Hawaiian senator. I don't remember if they were Republican or a Democrat. But they said each state that argued to join the union on the same basis as DC and was granted statehood, therefore the same should apply for DC. These are the kind of arguments that are being brought up today. This is the kind of prejudice that was held. Violence and racism was at the root of trying to stop almost every bid for statehood from every state that has ever existed. And I thought that was just like a really good argument because that wasn't something that I had really thought about, but like every state had to put in a bid for statehood at some point and was either denied or it was like a struggle for them. And then also in that was in episode 4, and in the same episode, another senator, sorry, I have to find it. Another senator, Mr. Lewis said, one man, one vote. Statehood is a civil rights issue. It's not right that we are here in 1993 debating whether we should give American citizens the right to vote. Like I just thought both those arguments were like some of the most compelling made in the whole podcast because they're pretty bipartisan and like just strictly based on facts, and it's kind of hard to argue with either of those.
I mean, we kind of talked about it earlier. I took it back to episode 2 with Boss Shepherd, just saying they took away the entire city's right to self-governance because of the overspending of one individual who actually did like amazing things for DC. But they still said, no, we're going to take away all of your voting power, all of your decision-making power. And they based that argument, said that voters aren't intelligent enough to elect sound representatives. And that felt extremely rooted in racism, especially when you contextualize it with everything that we talked about earlier.
I would argue that I have concerns for other parts of our country's intelligence. Maybe not DC. Sorry. I was gonna say that I think that the argument that I found the funniest, like in opposition to DC statehood, that I didn't really find compelling at all, was like the flag. I thought it was funny that they did like a whole little section about it, because for me, I was like, it's just a flag, like you add a star. It's not that difficult, I guess. But it seems like based off of what the reporter was saying, like it was a concern that so many people had. So I just thought that it was kind of funny that was an argument. So I put it under least compelling.
Plus, they talked about how like the flag changes all the time, and like, or it has changed quite a few times in the past, and like there's a whole group of people who are like really enthusiastic about it, and it would be like great for manufacturing because we're producing all these new flags and everything. Could be nice for the economy. I don't know.
I'm surprised the flag manufacturers aren't lobbying for DC to become a state.
Yeah, that goes to my point earlier, what you said about manufacturing. And I talked about the funding they would get. Like and they were able like to sell like recreational medical marijuana. They mentioned in one episode, I think it was episode 3. And then also what we talked about earlier with having better control over the prison system, and also the most important thing would be having voting representation in Congress.
You just mentioned the prison system, and I was thinking about one of the things that was brought up in episode 5 is that establishing the state prison system for DC specifically, that it would just be like costly and controversial, as there's like limited land in DC, which I know that's just like a logistic barrier to like hop through, and that, you know, when there's a will, there's a way. Um, so I put that under like one of the things that I found like the least compelling, because I was like, you've found places to put, you know, those kind of things before. So what's the issue here? I thought I think that for me, the most compelling argument is just the fact that the statehood would be a reestablishment of this, you know, lost or stolen right, which was talked about a lot in episode 2, talking about with Shepard. And those were 2 of the things that I had kind of pointed out.
The least compelling for me, Delvin, like you said, was they had a guy who was like really passionate about weed legalization on, I forget his name. It was in episode 5. And like the basis behind his argument that it should be DC's decision if it's legal or not, and like if they want to tax it or not, is like a valid argument to me. But using that as like the means for it was kind of uncompelling to me, and like especially in comparison to the other arguments like that deal with civil rights and racial stuff, it just seemed a little less serious. So that was probably the least compelling to me.
Do we want to go to the next? What arguments in the podcast did you find least compelling in favor of DC statehood, or more compelling in opposition to DC statehood?
I think the whole all of the governance concerns about DC's ability to govern itself effectively. I mean, they're talking about specifically issues with the prison system, and then also with like, I guess, policing power, and you know, then they relate that back to DC's like crime rate. Because there's some arguments throughout the podcast that DC officials can't be trusted to keep Washington safe. But I think that the issue is that one of the things that I talk about in a lot of my other classes is that like states have policing power, and states have the power to regulate, you know, and try to like make like those like kind of like what they consider effective or safe decisions. And DC doesn't have the space to do that currently, or doesn't have the, you know, means to do that because they are in a state. So I feel like that argument that they wouldn't be able to self-govern is just like, how do you know that? How do you like what makes you think that, besides the fact that like you're making this assumption based on their current lack of statehood, you know? That's, I think that was the least compelling thing for me.
I pulled one quote that I also put what you were discussing, Jewel, but the one other thing I put that was like a little bit less prevalent in the podcast, but I just thought was interesting, was there was a quote in episode 4. It was like, there is no citizen in Washington who is chained to the pillars of the Capitol or the Washington Monument. They can leave at any time. And that was kind of crazy to me, because I was like, okay, so they can like move out. I don't think that means that we don't have rights to vote. Like, it was just a very strange argument to me.
This was like a pretty tough question for me, because it's like I think it's asking for like why why is it a bad argument for DC to be a state, or why is it a good argument for it to not be a state? And it's like that. I think it should be a state. So like, it's kind of tough. But this is one that I pulled from. Sorry, I just lost it, from episode 4. How they talked about that DC doesn't have any industries that aren't supported by the federal government, and how that wasn't a compelling argument because you can't decide if a state is based on, or you can't decide if it's a state based on the industries. And I kind of thought about it more, and if it were the case that most of the industries in DC were federally supported and they don't have enough independent industries to raise revenue and support themselves, meaning that they'd be like reliant on federal funding, then I could potentially see an argument that they should be federally controlled. That's kind of like steel manning it. I don't think that that's a valid argument for DC to not be a state, but I could see how federal government would want jurisdiction over something that they majority pay for. But that being said, I still believe that DC residents should have a vote, even if that were the scenario.
So should we do the last question with the last couple minutes we have? It says, using information from the last week tonight episode on the U.S. territories, in what way, if any, do your opinions about granting or not granting statehood to DC extend to the debate over Puerto Rican statehood? Be specific and explain why / where you see similarities and differences between the two debates, and how those thoughts and feelings shape your overall support or opposition to statehood for Puerto Rico and potentially other territories. And oh my goodness, I saw so many similarities. It was actually a really good video. I thought yeah. But other people can go first.
I mean, I think it's funny because I mean there were a lot of similarities that you can point out in the video, but for me, I was looking at the opposition for not having DC be a state that makes the most sense to me is the fact that the framers wanted a federal city, like, you know, this federal city, which is the whole, I forget what the word was, that I was going to say reapportionment, but that's not it. It's the, I think maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, but I know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to continue. Like that makes the most sense to me, that like, okay, that we want this city that's, you know, federally run. Maybe we just make this district smaller then, and then Virginia and Maryland either can, you know, consume those, you know, excess districts, whatever. I think it's so funny here because that opposition doesn't apply because it's, you know, we're looking at, you know, US territories. These don't need to be federally run, you know, spaces. So for me, the argument for statehood here applies more, weirdly enough, than it does to, you know, DC. And I think in most regards. That was a long way to go about that answer. I'm sorry.
One of the things, I think it's only mentioned once, and it's mentioned pretty like minorly, but that really I don't know if it directly answers this question, but it kind of was really interesting to me, which is that residents of DC pay federal taxes, but residents of territories do not. I thought that was a really, really interesting. Let's see, it's mentioned in episode 6. And that's something I did not know. And that was like a really interesting consideration. I don't think it really changes my opinion on things, but I did just think that was a really interesting thing that makes DC not having those rights like maybe that much stranger. I don't know.
Kind of talked about how, like, right off the bat, in the episode, he said that there's 4.1 million people, 98.4% of which are ethnic minorities, which is kind of a similar argument for DC. You know, if you have the majority of the people in the district are minorities, and that's going to either implicitly or explicitly for some people affect decision making. And then those decisions are going to lead to the disenfranchisement of a minority community. So kind of the arguments are going to be the same for DC on that end as it is for Guam. The other statistic was 1/8 of Guananians, I think, are US military veterans, and that the nearest VA hospital is 3,800 miles away. And we talked a lot about how that's like one of the most compelling arguments is if you send somebody to war, you should take care of them afterwards. It's like pretty much a bipartisan thing. It's like one of the only things that's bipartisan nowadays. So I thought that those arguments are like exactly parallel. Is it Guianians? Does anybody know how to actually say that?
I think you got it right. But okay. I said I think with me, I saw like both similar between both Puerto Rico and DC. Like my thing was I feel like if they were both applied for statehood, they could come in both at the same time, make it like 52, like have an even number be at 52 instead of 51, like to help like I guess appease both sides, if you feel me? Like so that one side won't think that other side getting a power grab over the other. Maybe it might even out.
Going
Yeah,
back to
I think. Oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Mine was off topic. Mine was back to Guam, so go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, well, mine was also leaving the topic. I was just gonna say, American Samoa. That was a wild one to me. That they just like don't even have citizenship. I was like, what are they supposed to do? Like they just don't have citizenship.
Yeah, another
Like
one
how
that
bizarre.
was crazy to me too was in Guam. I think they said Guam has the highest like level of registered voters that actually turn out and vote for the presidential election, even though their vote doesn't count. And that was just really sad to me because there's so many people that live in the like main 50 states that can vote and don't. So
Yeah, they were talking about the straw polling there. And like I think it was like I think it was like 67 versus like 61% or something like that, like the voter average. And I think it was 2012 is the year that they pointed out. And I think I fight with my friends and with my roommates so much about like, please, dear God, register to vote or please go and actually vote. And it's an argument that with besides this last year that I have like very much lost. And so like I like listen to that and like watch that video and I'm like, that puts things so much into perspective for me is that why there are people who are actively like wanting to like, you know, voice their concerns and are actively like wanting to have like this representation that we just don't allow them to. And I feel like for me that was one of the most compelling arguments specifically with Guam too. Was just looking at that. Like that's a straw poll. Like that means absolutely nothing for us in the States. Like that's just something that people are like showing up to for their own volition to like show that they like have, you know, some that you know that they have some sort of stake in this, you know, conversation and this argument and they want representation. And so I think that like that plea is very eye-opening and very compelling for me.
Yeah, I kind of also thought that the straw poll was like insane, like that they got that high turnout. But I kind of wondered if that was maybe like a mobilization strategy where they're like, okay, this isn't going to count, but it's going to show like if you guys turn up and vote, we will get a vote. And that in itself might be a way to get people to the polls. So I like wondered if they actually did get the vote, would that number drop a little bit? And I don't know.
I don't know either, but I did look, I ended up going on their Wikipedia, on the Wikipedia for that, to see the history of like the straw polling. Like there have been like, there's like straw polls like every year. And so maybe it's like a continued mobilization effort, but like still it's like something that like this group of people in this, you know, US territory are like explicitly concerned about and are like wanting like more, um, are wanting more from the United States in regards to this. Um, that was maybe that mobilization is like, I think that argument is valid, but I also think that like this is also just like a historical like concern for these people within the last like 10-15 years.
At a minimum, it shows that they want to vote. That's for sure.
We are at time. So I don't know if anyone Dipskis. Okay.
Well,
Is
it's good talking to y'all. I'll see you in class.
see you in class.